Congressman. Thank you very much for joining us for this last session in which we will attempt to do the impossible. And by that I mean make these microphones work. I'm told that if you press the button now, the red light comes on, you may speak. It's an entirely new system. We are changing infrastructure as we progress here. So we'll attempt that. We also want to try to achieve something else that's, if not impossible, extremely unlikely. And that is identify things that we can actually do on infrastructure in the Washington of today. And of course, all of you who have gone and looked at your Twitter feeds now in the past hour have seen the latest evidence of the nature of Washington today, where Representative McCarthy is now the second person of prominence in the past couple of weeks to determine that he doesn't want the second most powerful job in the world. You know, so if the second most powerful job in the world is so odious that the guy who has it doesn't want it, and the guy who could have had it just for asking doesn't want it, it says something about what's going on here that we need to address. Strangely, we're talking about a subject where there should be a concurrence of views, regardless of politics. And we are very fortunate to have our panelists to discuss us. And also joining us here now, we have Senator Chris Coons and Representative John Delaney, who are extremely thoughtful on these subjects. And gentlemen, just to brief you a little bit on where we've been, besides the Vice President and Senator Warren and Senator Warner and Mayor Emanuel and this distinguished group talking about it, we've tried to tee up the problem with the idea being that during this session, we'd like to say, what are practical ideas that can actually get done today, politically, that can help us close the gap, whether we say it's a $3.8 trillion gap or $1.7 trillion gap, or it's something that we can do in financing and leverage up to close it. What's possible? Let me turn to you first, Senator Coons.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David. And I'd like to thank Bernard Schwartz and the folks at Carnegie who've helped pull this together and make this possible. I don't have a long menu of things that are easily, immediately possible. I'll simply comment on your opening remark about the race for Speaker. It's not really that Speaker Boehner and Congressman McCarthy don't want the job. It's that it is an exceptionally difficult job to secure because there are some significant fissures within the other party. I happen to be a Democrat, for those of you who may not know. Let me give you just two examples that are intended to be modestly encouraging. One is that in the Senate, you've got Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma and Senator Barbara Boxer of California. Not exactly ideological soulmates, who managed to work together in a balanced and bipartisan way to pass a 6-year reauthorization of MAP 21 with ultimately 3 years of funding. Is it everything it needed to be? No. But it actually got through an otherwise very divided and contentious EPW committee and got through an otherwise divided and partisan Senate. And it suggests that compromise in these areas is possible. Let me also reference the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, of interest to any of us who happen to be from states or communities that have major harbors and that are looking at our role in the world in terms of competition and the key role that harbors play in allowing us to access the world economy, recognize that it's funded by a surcharge, a user fee, on the community that is shipping into these ports. It has built up a roughly $6 billion reserve fund. And only through sort of discipline and bipartisan action in the Appropriations Committee over the last 2 Congresses have we finally gotten through worded to a place where there is a plan to begin spending the money in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund on harbor maintenance. It has otherwise been used to fill other gaps in the Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee to address other needs the Army Corps has. So first, making sure that the funds that we are collecting are actually dedicated to the infrastructure purposes for which they were collected is an important first point. Second, making sure that the bipartisanship we've seen on authorization can go over to appropriation is the key second part. But as we all know, the most important question is how do we pay for it? And in my view, the biggest infrastructure challenge, which is the roads and the tunnels and the bridges and the highways of America, really can only be solved by raising the gas tax. There are critical public-private partnership options that I assume Congressman Delaney will talk about. The Bridge Act in the Senate, I assume Senator Warner spoke about it, which I'm a co-sponsor, is an important infrastructure financing opportunity, but has made very little progress. There is a VMT test going on out in Oregon that long-term is something that would be quite promising, but doesn't have, I think, a reasonable opportunity to be enacted within the next couple of years. As I'm sure you've covered in great detail before now, the importance of investment in infrastructure is very high for our competitiveness. Its potential impact on employment and our economy would be massive, and yet how to pay for it remains the sole key unresolved issue, at least in the Senate. There are several prominent Republicans who have come out in favor of raising the gas tax. My senior senator, Tom Carper, has for many years been in favor of and has articulated the argument for raising the gas tax. I think we need to find a forcing mechanism that allows us to put that piece of revenue on the table as part of a larger deal that raises the caps, raises the BCA caps, and gets us to a resolution on a wide range of issues, because it is an absolutely essential part of moving our economy forward. And without a revenue stream, all the financing vehicles or new authorization we want will not sustain what we critically need for a strong and healthy economy, and that's a world-class modern infrastructure.
And raising the gas tax in an environment where the price of gas is actually lower than it has been would seem to be an opportunity, certainly.
And in a striking number of states that have Republican governors and Republican legislatures, and where they had no other choice, they have raised gas taxes in more than a dozen states. And yet the relevant legislatures and governors have not been thrown out of office because I think the average American recognizes that you get what you pay for, and a gas tax is a user fee. So I do think it is something that is politically defensible if we would but have the courage to stand up and do so.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to Representative Delaney here for a second. Then we're going to do our 4 polling questions, and then I'm going to turn to all of you. But I want you to stay focused on what the objective here is, which is focusing on things that can actually get done at the federal, state, or local level that you think are material to making a difference to this. Representative Delaney.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And I also want to thank Bernard Schwartz for his leadership on this issue, and it's great to be here with the good senator from Delaware. So I think in terms of what can get done is if we think about increasing our infrastructure funding and pairing it with international tax reform, which doesn't seem like a logical pairing immediately, but if we pursue that strategy, I think it's not only substantively very good for the country, but politically doable. And we've been working on that for a couple years and have proven that by putting together a large bipartisan coalition of about 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans that have supported legislation that actually fixes our international tax system and allocates the money to infrastructure. Pivoting quickly to international tax, I think most people know what the problem there is. We have a system that effectively encourages companies to keep their money overseas, and as a result, it deprives the U.S. government of tax revenues on their earnings. Most people think that system should be fixed to take away companies' ability to defer their taxes and keep the cash overseas, makes them pay the tax currently at a lower rate, and gives them the flexibility to bring the money back and forth. Pretty much everyone who's looked at that issue believes that that international tax reform will generate substantial revenues. And depending upon the proposal, Republicans think it'll generate 100 to 120 billion of revenues, and Democrats think that number is up to 200 to 240 billion. But that's the spread in an international tax deal. It generates 100 to say $200 billion. We've proven that if you do that deal and at the same time you launch a large national infrastructure program through both a highway bill and additional infrastructure capability through an infrastructure bank or an infrastructure fund, that makes for a really good bipartisan deal, because you're giving Democrats something that we've pushed for a long time, which is more infrastructure, and we all know the reasons we need more infrastructure. It makes us competitive, it creates jobs, it improves the lives of our citizens, and it's been proven to be a good investment. And it's been the top of our platform for years. And our Republican colleagues have been pushing for this international tax reform. And they've correctly pointed out that the system we have now has perverse incentives, and it's causing $2 trillion of cash to sit overseas, and we should be creating pathways for that money to come back. So that deal, which could be cut 50 different ways, where you simultaneously fix the international tax system and give our Republican colleagues a big win on something they've cared about, and you pair that with an infrastructure program, seems like not only good kind of double bottom line policy for the country, but also good politics because each side gets a win. And I believe that's very actionable. I think we've proven that with our bill, which again has 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans, including people from the most conservative part of the Republican caucus of the House and people from the most progressive side of the Democrat caucus of the House. So that's what I think we should do. I think the gas tax can be a component of that, but I think we have to have a view that the gas tax utility hopefully will sunset in the future. I mean, if the world unfolds the way we'd like it to unfold, if we envision a future in 10 years where the amount of gasoline used by American consumers in transportation, both sides of the aisle and everyone should want that number to be way down. We want it to be down for climate change purposes. We want it to be down for kind of pocketbook purposes for the American people. And that world will have more electric vehicles, more hybrid vehicles, probably natural gas vehicles, et cetera. So if we're successful on many other fronts from a matter of public policy, gas utilization in this country will go way down. And so we have to have a view that we're going to have to transition away from the gas tax, which doesn't mean, as the senator pointed out, it's not the right answer to be part of a solution now. But I actually think the pairing with international tax is very doable. Chairman Ryan's come out in favor of it. Chuck Schumer's come out in favor of it. The White House has come out in favor of it. The devil or God is in the details on how that deal gets cut, but I think there's a really good deal to do, and the time to do it is now, because the infrastructure situation is urgent. And quite frankly, this international tax system with these inversions that are occurring and corporations making decisions to increasingly invest overseas, that's a pretty darn urgent situation too.
Well, what you're describing sounds eminently logical, and we live in a city where there's an inverse relationship between logic and what actually has the likelihood of getting done.
But it politically, I mean, if you have Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, Paul Ryan, who is arguably the most influential Republican in the House, right? And if you have Chuck Schumer, who's, you know, if the Democrats take control of the Senate, will be in charge of the Senate. And if you have the White House all agreeing, unlike other issues where the ideological divide seems uncrossable, this is actually, to me, down to more of the details.
Well, that's what I want to get at. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but just practically speaking, when you say the devil's in the details, how do you get from a good idea with 50 people on both sides, on either side of the aisle supporting it, and the White House and the Congress and everybody aligned, to getting it done? Why wouldn't it get done? Why would this not happen?
So listen, there's two components to the deal. How much do you spend on infrastructure, and what deal do you cut on international tax reform, right? And so that's kind of where it breaks down. I tend to think the spread on those things is not as wide as people think. Minimum funding for a highway trust fund reauthorization for 6 years is about $100 billion. Minimum revenues generated through international tax reform on the Republican side is probably about $120 billion. On the Democrat side is about $200 billion. So that's, you know, again, I think if the Republicans insist on international tax reform and a minimum amount going to infrastructure and money going for tax cuts, it's probably not a deal the Democrats will do. If the Democrats ask for too much infrastructure funding and want the international tax rates on a go-forward basis to be too high, it's not a deal the Republicans support. But that's, I really think, where it's going to come down to some of those issues.
Is it a deal that's more likely to happen in the last year of an 8-year presidency or the first year of a new presidency?
You know, it's hard for me to answer that question without kind of speaking my book, which is I'd like it to happen in the last year of an 8-year presidency.
Okay, that's okay. You're allowed to speak your book. Can we go to the what do we have, 4 questions? 4. We're going to just go very quickly. This will take 2 minutes. What has been the biggest political barrier to increased infrastructure investment? Congressional hyperpartisanship, end of congressional earmarks, recent concerns over deficit spending, or a lack of political interest in infrastructure, or other? And again, we'll go through these very quickly just to get a sense of the room's thoughts on all of this. And also to keep everybody engaged post-lunch. So 41% say congressional hyperpartisanship, and then it's pretty much clumped together following that. Who said other? What was other?
All of the above.
Thank you. That's the one forbidden other. Yes. Yes.
The overemphasis on the federal use is a big barrier too. We think the federal government's going to
Hit the button in front of you, and just elaborate on that for a moment.
that we overemphasize the federal role in a lot of these things, where the federal government should be doing a lot of different things, but the big barrier to getting something done is that we think that they're going to solve all the problems. The federal government only has really a relatively small.
So too much focus on the federal side of the thing. Okay, next question, quickly. What is the best way to frame infrastructure to gain enough bipartisan support to break through political gridlock? One, as a way to boost competitiveness. Two, as job creation. Three, as a conduit for economic growth. Four, as an investment in the future rather than spending or other. And again, all of the above could work, but let's try to avoid that. And so the investment rather than spending, which is a point we've made here over and over again, is one that seems to be the leader among all of you. Who said other? What did you mean?
If you look at McCarthy's resignation, or non-seeking the speaker's position, and the conservatives in the House really not wanting to work with anyone, you're just going to get gridlock, and gridlock.
Well, no, I understand. But the point of this is, what's the best way to sell it? Not what's the problem. Yes?
National security interest.
Selling it as a national security interest. Okay, yes.
Social mobility, post-Ferguson, post-Baltimore, both of those conversations should have had an infrastructure component to it, because Roosevelt was saying earlier, getting people access to jobs, getting them out of these neighborhoods has an infrastructure component.
Right. I thought the vice president's comment about job sprawl was kind of an interesting comment and a kind of interesting change of pace here. Yes, quickly.
Yeah, I think,
Loudly and quickly.
sorry, I think it makes sense to talk to individuals within Congress because they have their own constituents, they have their own interests and experiences. Someone who has
Oh.
that has a military base might be more
Okay. All politics is local. Next. Which of the following policy decisions is most needed to ensure sufficient public infrastructure funding? A bank, or a bank that we don't call a bank? Reestablishment of publicly investable bonds, an enactment of a repatriation tax, development of national capital account, expanding the scope of existing government programs like TIFIA, or other? After this, we have one more? Okay. And of course, all of these things are paths forward. It's just to get a sense. So the bank leads this group, 34%. Next is expanding the scope of existing government programs like TIFIA, followed by the bonds. 6% said other. Somebody said other. Why?
I think I agree with Bob. I think we need to de-emphasize the federal role. You have a ton of regulations and gridlock in Congress. I think that the states have done a fairly good job of picking up the role in transportation, and I think that they should be further empowered to do so.
Think of the progress we're making here. This is Brookings and Heritage agreeing with each other. It's a small step. Yeah.
The problem is, many states, it varies from state to state because of the formula. But in Pennsylvania, we get about 47% of our transportation funding from the federal government.
Right. Right. It's not. You can't completely.
Take it away.
You can't. If it's 2/3, 1/3, you can't take away the 1/3. It won't get done.
And I
Right.
wouldn't suggest taking it away by any stretch of the imagination. I think the federal role, we need to have a strong, reliable federal partner, but they need to focus. They're not going to be able to do everything. Any evidence to the contrary. I don't think that if we're trying to make bets on who's going to be innovating in the future, I think you heard very clearly this morning that all of the optimism and the affirmative conversations from the mayor and Ford.
Okay. Yeah. But I'm going to just play referee here. I don't think there's a disagreement. You're not saying you have to leave out the federal, and you're not saying that you
No,
can't bring it in, right?
But
So,
there are some projects that have to be regional in their nature.
right.
Someday we're going to have to build high-speed rail from Washington to Boston. Someday, and it ought to be soon. And that can only be done by the federal government, bringing the states together, but it can only be done
Exactly. So there's federal leadership. Yeah, sure.
And we should remember, and I'm very supportive of public-private partnerships, but the federal government has a materially lower cost of capital than the private sector. And the more we shift to the private sector, that will have to directly translate to increased cost to consumers. Definitionally.
Right. And some of these things are monetizable via public-private partnerships. Some of them are not. And so then you have to figure out what's the most affordable way to get to them. One more question, the last question here. What is the most politically charged aspect of paying for infrastructure? The role of the federal versus state and local, financing programs at the federal level, competing spending priorities, privatization, or other. Obviously, again, not one of these things, but just to get a sense of what you think the top of the list is in terms of hurdles. And so the leading one is federal government versus state and local, obviously, since we've just seen that play out here for 3 minutes. So, pardon me? 3 is leading. Oh, sorry, and competing spending. Oh, yeah, it edged it out there. Competing spending edged it out. Okay, so that's the lay of the land in the mindset of everybody here. What I want to do now, and we've got just about a half an hour, is try to get everybody involved in talking about solutions that make sense. Now, I saw John Cowan has walked in from Third Way. Welcome, John. I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this. Set a good example for everybody. What I'd like is sort of fairly brief, crisp, focus on an idea you think can get done in this political environment.
Thank you, and thank you, Bernard, for doing this. Very crisp. There's a lot of good ideas. I would lay out 3 very brief principles that I think it's going to take to get anything done. 3 C's to oversimplify. One is context. If Americans see this as crucial to long-term economic growth, they're much more inclined. Second is compromise. Congressman Delaney and Senator Coons nailed this on the head. It's not just, I say this as a Democrat, it's not just Republicans who are going to have to bend on something. Democrats too have to bend, whether it's going to be on repatriation or some other vehicle. And thirdly, competence. We have to be able to show the American people that the money's going to be well spent. And when they think of things like the big dig in Boston, it undermines public support. If we follow those 3 principles, I actually think whether it's at the end of this presidency or the beginning of the next, I think the odds are very high that we do something consequential.
Very high. Optimistic. Senator?
I'll add a fourth, perhaps less optimistic, but more relevant forcing mechanism, C, which is crisis. When the I-35 bridge collapsed in the middle of a busy rush hour and folks fell 100 feet to their death in the upper Midwest a number of years ago, that really focused the attention of the relevant senators. We had a major bridge in Delaware nearly collapse last year. I would say I was perhaps intellectually persuaded of the value of investment in infrastructure, but having 100,000 of my neighbors complain daily about the huge gridlock and backup helped force it. We are building towards a serious infrastructure crisis in this country, and that I think will also help push the question of compromise. I do think that the menu that John laid out is exactly what should happen. There are some folks in my caucus who are fairly rigidly opposed to the international tax reform that he's talked through and the competing priorities. There's lots of other purposes folks have in mind for that $100 to $200 billion. Over time, the menu you suggested, plus the growing sense of crisis in the collapse and failure of key infrastructure, I think will get us to a point of compromise.
We just have a plan of action.
So no, it's good.
A few more bridges.
It's good. So no, that's what I was going to say. So you think Governor Christie deserves a commendation for backing up traffic on the George Washington Bridge and thus forcing the focus on this issue. Scott and then Carl. Okay, go ahead.
I'll add, we're going to stick with alphabet, another C, and that's consensus. And I think we've done something today really exciting that Bernard has initiated.
Were we in the room for this?
No, I think we have. I think what we've done is we understand that there is a consensus for infrastructure. If it's labeled a little differently, we need to take it out of the context of cultural warfare, political cultural warfare, and there ought to be, coming out of this, I would hope, a movement, a real movement, call it what you will, build America, whatever, And all of the elements that we've talked about today, young people particularly, entrepreneurs, government, mayors, people on the ground, maybe you call some kind of Build America Summit, the entertainment industry. I think we've got a lot of ideas that all coalesce. And my practical notion would be to use this notion that this is not as controversial as we went in here thinking. If we come out of it with the idea, first, let's get this to the ground that we agree on, that people in this country agree on, which is surprising. Scott brought this up earlier. And build a movement and figure out how do you build a movement. And then when there are movements, political institutions respond, even the U.S. Congress, which will be the last to respond, but it could. But without a movement, and Bernard, I would say also the presidential candidates, get one of them to say, you know, this ought to be one of the great issues of this campaign, and I call on all of the candidates to come up with a program for infrastructure that we argue fact-based about how do we do it, not whether we do it. So I'm just trying
By the way, I just as a footnote there, I don't know how many of you read Hillary Clinton's statement yesterday when she expressed her disapproval of TPP at the moment, but she said that I picked up at the moment, but that's something we can discuss separately, I guess. But she in the fourth paragraph, she then said, "We have neglected investing in the things we need to invest in the United States," and she listed infrastructure as first among those. So it's clearly at the front of mind. Scott.
The interesting thing, build upon what Carl said, the interesting thing about infrastructure investment is if you look at all the expenditures of government, what they spend money on, I don't think you can point to another one that has measurable, and it doesn't matter what your metrics are. If you want to talk about return on investment, financial, economic growth, you want to talk about social mobility, leveling the playing field, whatever, there are metrics that you can use with infrastructure investment. There is nothing else that returns as much as this investment. And yet that seems to get muddled in the conversation. We don't really talk about how if you distrust government, if you think government's the answer, regardless of what side you're on, I can give you a great example of how investing in basic infrastructure brings a return that I can measure. It's not just pie in the sky. And yet that we don't really focus on that as much as we should. I found that when you start doing that and personalizing it, and it's very easy to personalize an investment in infrastructure to the individual voter, to the 100,000 people who all of a sudden call you. It's easier, and once we do that, that's when you get the broad-based support. That's when you get people on both sides, because they recognize that this is one part of government that actually does not only pay for itself, but it returns many times more than what it
Right.
pays.
So it's a recurring theme here. It may seem obvious, but it's localize it, personalize it. You know, that's where it resonates. Congressman, then I'm going to go to Damon, then I'm going to go to Michael. Yeah.
So I think Scott brings up a really good point, and it's an issue that gets to the heart of how government thinks about things, which is how they score things, right? Right now, the government scores everything as being a zero. So if you invest in infrastructure or basic research, which are the two highest return on investments the government makes if you think about economic multipliers, and it's been proven with 50 years of data, it scores the same as expanding the government bureaucracy, right? It's all viewed to have no return on investment. And if you draw an analogy to the private sector, if private companies viewed all investments as being a zero, they would never make any of them, right? And that's a big structural issue. And Will Marshall's group has done a lot of work on thinking about dynamically scoring these things. And it shows that when you actually invest in infrastructure, you're really only probably spending 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. And that's only looking at the direct cost, right, meaning the jobs that are created from. That doesn't even count some of the ancillary economic activity. And I agree with Carl. I mean, I think, and I've made this point to our caucus, we could build our whole platform, and I think someone could build a whole platform on $1 trillion national infrastructure program. Because everything else we care about, jobs, opportunity, everything, in some ways are subsidiaries of this, right? And you could go to every congressional district in the country and come up with the top 5 infrastructure projects and have a huge digital map showing everything you would do if you were elected and how you'd rebuild America. So I think it's a really good point.
Yeah, and by the way, I like the last bit of that, which is go to every district, come up with the top 5, make it specific, make it not abstract, not a theoretical thing for a think tank. Damon. I'll go to Michael, and then I'm going to go to Jeff.
So,
Don't, if you, that'll explode, I'm pretty sure.
if we, I think we're having we're trying to solve these very challenging political problems in a very short time, and we're actually having 2 conversations. One of them is about the immediate challenges of issues like how to fund the Surface Transportation Act, something that's of enormous importance to the labor movement, and how to do more of the kinds of things that Mayor Emanuel was speaking about this morning. How to expand the opportunities that programs like TIFIA create for state and local governments. And then we're having another conversation, which is how do we change the scale of the whole thing? How do we get to the kinds of multi-trillion-dollar deficits that Senator Warner mentioned in terms of our infrastructure needs? And so I think there are 2 different kinds of answers. In terms of the immediate needs, I would really draw a distinction between, for example, the 2 solutions that have been put on the table by Senator Coons and Congressman Delaney. The gas tax is, frankly, a regressive tax that we have to increase. And that's a very tough thing for us to say, right? Because regressive means that our members will pay more than more affluent people. But we've come to the conclusion that it has to be done. It's a lot easier to get done than to try to restructure the international corporate tax system. Congressman Delaney has worked very hard to try to find the formula that works, and we've sat with him and worked on it with him. It's very difficult. It's not very difficult because smart people with an understanding of cost of capital and tax rates and so forth can't find the answer. It's very difficult because the politics are extraordinarily hard. The corporate community pays 0 taxes on that money, and so anything more than 0 offends them. From the labor movement's perspective, we have a very strong position we are not going to back down on, which is that we will not support anything that leaves the corporate tax system incentivizing offshoring U.S. jobs, which frankly is what most of the repatriation proposals will do. When we will fight them because they will fundamentally undermine the strength of our economy and will be, in reality, when you cost it out over a long period of time, a gigantic corporate tax break at a time when, in every respect, our members are being asked to pay for austerity. Now,
how do we get to something we can do? Right.
Therefore, what I'm suggesting is that it is mathematically possible to solve the corporate tax problem in a way that funds infrastructure. I do not believe at this moment it is politically possible to do so. On the other hand, I think the gas tax can get done. It's not easy, and I don't understand Senator Coons saying that it is, but I believe it can get done. The question, though, then is how do you expand the larger conversation? And here, we've had, I think, very positive comments from Scott that I want to echo. This is just we're never going to cross that bridge to scale until there's a real conversation across the aisle. And, I've been in very few rooms that really amount to that in any respect. And it's very hard to do. We always end up talking to ourselves. There are 2 things Scott said that I completely agree with, and I hope that we can forward together. The first is to insist on some rhetorical discipline. This is about the future competitiveness of the United States, productivity, investment. I hope I'm quoting Scott accurately, but we have to talk about that at every turn. That's what this is about. It's about our future as a country. The second is I'm very taken with the idea, and it may seem very modest, but I think it's potentially revolutionary in its implications, of a real bipartisan groups, not representing people who all already agree, but a real bipartisan group of people talking about a long-term infrastructure plan. It's a lot easier to have these conversations if we start talking about the things we would invest in that would make better lives for our country's people, and then start talking about the money. And so I would leave you with those 2 observations about the 2 pieces of the task that we are going for.
No, that's super helpful. And by the way, again, just in the interest of noting progress where we have it made, we have here the former mayor of the most conservative city in America and the AFL-CIO coming
And I'm just
together.
trying to figure out how I'm going to quote Damon in my next Republican primary campaign mailer. Supported by AFL-CIO, that's a winner.
Yeah, that's. I see a bunch of you, so I'm going to try to get to all of you, but let's keep them fairly crisp because we have 15 minutes. Michael.
Okay, great. So there's been a lot of talk about actually bringing young people to the table, so I'm very glad to be up here. This is a really distinguished panel, so it's very humbling to be here. But first on young people, I'm a millennial. I live in Washington. I don't own a car. I walk to work. I'm very much in a small minority among my cohorts. This alleged change amongst young people has been kind of distorted by the media and among other studies. If you actually look at the data, over 3/4 of young people still commute to work by car. Even if you look at young people in the cities, the very people who are supposed to be pushing their cars off cliffs and hopping on the 8th Street streetcar, still 40% of young people in the cities drive to work. So sorry to disappoint you on that. Secondly, just on kind of the culture of crisis that we're hearing about infrastructure, Vice President Biden addressed it, so did Senator Warren. Again, this is a bit, I want to push back gently on this. It is a bit of a cynical way to kind of sell this. If you actually look at the deficient bridges in the country, the percentage of deficient bridges in the nation has gone down by 50% since 1990. Road quality has increased over the past 10 years. And all of these bridges that we've seen collapse that have been somewhat cynically seized on to say we need to up infrastructure spending, we need a big spending package right now. Not one, not I-35, not the recent I-10, not the Minnesota
Okay,
bridge
but
collapse.
let's move forward into the focus of this discussion, which is identify the problem and find a concrete solution for the problem, not to minimize the problem. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I'm not
I'm sorry,
subverting
this
your
is-
argument, but
Yeah.
we have 15 minutes left and we're focusing on solutions.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, this was my first time to get to speak to
I
this, so
understand.
I just wanted to get those out of the way. Just on things we can do going forward, Mayor Emanuel spoke very favorably about TIFIA, which I think is not perfect, but in the current
Okay.
situation, I think that this is something that the federal government can do to encourage private sector investment in infrastructure projects. However, the bill that the Senate passed in July cuts it by 50%, and I think that is a serious problem.
Look, you've driven away Congressman Delaney.
Sorry, Congressman. The senator is still here, though, and they're
Yeah,
the one that passed
okay.
the bill. And also P3s, just doing anything that we can to better the regulatory environment. Free federal money at the free money at the federal level is indeed very expensive. So doing anything we can to streamline that process.
Great, very quickly. Jeff, and then Ed, and then we'll go over to Governor Rendell. Yes?
I think we're getting a little rhapsodic about
Well, let's not. Let's just talk about solutions.
If I would I think if you ask the public what was more important to invest in, education or infrastructure, it would be a pretty close call. I don't think it's runaway infrastructure, which leads me to my point again, which I made earlier. We need a task force to define the issue for America, and I think it should involve specifics. The 40 most important infrastructure projects we should be doing now, which should hit everybody at a local level. This should involve a social return metric, which I think we can compute, and I think then we begin to talk about how to finance this. Then we begin to develop a serious consensus. I'll stop there.
Terrific. Ed?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about roads and bridges. We haven't mentioned really the internet and broadband in all of this. And I do have a simple solution, having defined the problem being average speeds here are a lot lower than other OECD countries.
Average internet speeds.
Internet speeds to home, and the access to high speed, only roughly 3/4 of Americans only have access to one high speed provider of over 25 megabits a second. So that's very, very low by the standards of Japan and France. And so that's the problem, and I think it's a really key infrastructural problem, and I think there's a really simple solution to this that doesn't involve Congress. And that's the FCC reclassifies the internet as a telecommunications sector rather than a personal information sector, and that gives it the right to regulate competition in the last mile. Those who own the last mile are forced to open up to competitors. That's what's got Tokyo at 100 megabits average speeds versus 25 or below here. And I think it's a very, very simple solution that costs not a dollar of taxpayer money.
This is the kind of big government thinking that has made Jeremy Corbyn the man he is today. No, just very, very quickly.
That's an area we've done an enormous amount of work on. And as much as we love each other, I got to say I really disagree with that. If you look at the latest Akamai reports on peak internet speeds, which is the most accurate measure, we're actually not. We're about 20% lower, 25% lower than Korea. We're in the top 10. Our speeds have been growing about 40% a year. The reason we have a third of the people without internet is not because they don't have a network. In fact, even if you look at Korea, 50% of the people don't have 25 megs or better. So, and I actually think Title II is actually completely the wrong approach. It's going to reduce investment. It's not going to expand it. The reason we have more investment than Europe does. We have more fiber than Europe does. Their profit rates in Europe are higher. Their ISP profit rates are higher than ours. So it's a really complicated issue that
Okay, that's fine. But, we're seeking solutions. That was an effort for a solution. Governor.
Two quick things about how we can persuade the public, and I think Scott's point about making as local as we can is a good one. But there are two arguments that we should take a look at. First and foremost, the cost of doing nothing. The Corker-Murphy bill in the Senate, raising the gas tax 10 cents and earmarking it to inflation. For the average American driver, it's about $110 a year. One tire goes out in a pothole. One tire goes out, they double that. The cost of sitting in congestion, the lost gasoline, Texas Transportation estimates over $880 per consumer. The cost of doing nothing to the average American is higher than the cost of doing something. You have to make that argument all the time. Secondly, there's a CBO report in 2008 which says that $180 billion of additional infrastructure spending a year could be justified by the economic benefits, tax benefits that are accrued under social benefits. We should do more with that stuff.
Excellent points. David, we've got 4 minutes left, so people are going to have to keep it really crisp.
60 seconds or less. I just wanted to second what Jeff said about the task force. I wanted to put forward, by way of suggestion, a template for something that could be used in the future, which is the very first thing I worked on at Carnegie, was a task force set up. I did research commissioned by Governor Tom Ridge, so former Republican executive, regional, former Senator Bill Bradley, legislative, and former Comptroller General David Walker, independent. I think you need two axes. You need bipartisan, and you also need a mix of from the executive, the legislative level, all the way through. Thanks.
Well, we talked a lot about political obstacles to what we want to do, but I don't think winning public support for large-scale infrastructure projects is as easy as maybe some assume in this room, because a cloud, hangs over all public spending, all government activity right now. The public's withdrawn massively trust from government. So we really have to pay attention to how we do this. And when politicians propose a big infrastructure project, and then constituents who pay for it or pay partially for it don't see anything happening in 10 years in any reasonable time frame, they get very cynical about this activity. So how you do it really matters. The need for speed, the need to bring infrastructure into the modern era where you can get on your cell phone and get answers to things, that you can make purchases, you can operate in real time. If we don't do that, I honestly think a lot of, all this talk about where we're going to find money is going to be stillborn, because we're not going to have the public support for spending it through the old mechanisms.
Okay. Very quickly.
Just one final plug for Build America bonds. I think your comment about the education, I think, is a good one. 35% of Build America bond spending went for education purposes. The rest for water, roads, and sewers. So Build America bonds is something we should be talking about.
And school district. Okay, so look, I want to end this thing on time because everybody has given generously of their time. This is not the end of our discussion, and I'll sum up a bit in a second about where it goes from here. But I want to go to two summations. And the first one is not expected. You don't expect to sum up, but you've been sitting here listening to infrastructure discussions for a long time. And having listened to today, what's your big takeaway?
I do come away with takeaways. First of all, I commend everybody here for looking at solutions rather than to describe what the crisis is. There is a crisis. but the idea of what do we do about it has been the fundamental part of the dialogue today, and I congratulate you for attending to that. A couple of things I've come away with. I've learned something. Terminology does count. Banks may not be the idea of what a bank is, and how it fits into the overall program is important. I still very much favor it, but maybe we ought to call it something else. The second takeaway is that financial scoring by the CBO and others in Congress hurts. It not only hurts us, it hurts the country, and it not only hurts the country, but it's been wrong consistently. Scoring does not pick up the assets part of the expenditure. It doesn't treat the true expenditure. For example, we talk here about infrastructure that might cost, to bring us up to date, $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion, maybe more. Okay, that's not the cost to the American people. That is what the cost of the projects are. There isn't any project proposal that we're talking about that talks about the U.S. government and the people of our country paying 100% of a project. Only the shortfall is what we're talking about, and over an 8, 9, 10-year period, that might be $100 billion. It's eminently doable in this country. The third thing is that I learned here today how important bipartisanship is. We're not going to get anywhere unless we get people from both sides of the aisle to be talking about a program. Not the idea of infrastructure, because everybody's in favor of infrastructure. But we have to come up with a solution that appeals on a bipartisan way and gets the support within the Congress. Also, I might say that we are talking about an investment. We're not talking about expenditure. What all of us recognize is that we are building America, and that's the important part, and we are approaching crisis. When you look at the long history of the United States government, we have had more bad management in our national politics and national leadership than we have had good government. But we have made extraordinary progress. And the progress was made when two things were in existence: crisis and at the same time leadership. Hopefully we're going to get leadership going forward. Unfortunately, we're going to have crisis. I might say also that I believe today more than I believed when I walked into this room that a solution is doable, that we can find a doable solution that will pass. I am much encouraged by the people who have come here today who are much more knowledgeable about what infrastructure is all about. Mayors really have to solve the problem of when infrastructure breaks down. And unfortunately, senators have to worry about it too. I can walk to work, so I don't really care. But the fact of the matter is, we can do the trick. I think the time is right for us to do it. And the kind of expressions I've heard here today only encourage me.
Thank you, Bernard. You know, Debbie, I'm going to take advantage of my moderator's prerogative here because I thought Bernard's summation was so good, and I saw you sitting there writing notes. But the reality is that Bernard summed up the essence of what we discussed today exceptionally well, and I don't want to gild the lily myself, so I think we should close it at that, because it was a note of optimism. It was a note of practicality. It was a note of urgency. And all of these things coming together can actually make this next couple of years periods of extremely high productivity. We'll need other events like this. We'll sum up this event. We'll send the findings to all of you. We'll send the findings to decision makers. We'll reconvene you. We'll try to do so with even more diverse groups of people because it's going to take bigger coalitions. And we will try to move the ball down the field within the guidelines of the principles that we've described here today. Before you all go, though, I want to say, first of all, I want to say thank you to the folks here at the hotel. I want to say thank you to the Carnegie events team. I want to say thank you to my colleagues at Gordon Rothkopf who did the polling. I want to say thank you to my colleagues from Foreign Policy who came over here and helped with the organization of all of this. And I especially want to say thank you to Susan Torricelli and to Bernard for the impetus behind all of these things and enabling this program to continue onward. Please join me in thanking all of them for a really terrific day.